Take up the shield. Grasp the spear. Sharpen the sword's edge. This is a day of destiny. Today, the carrion birds...
Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all doing well today. Thank you for joining me on stream. Today we're going to be discussing, of course, the new patch and all of the things that are new in it. Well, many of them. In any case, there are too many things. I don't think I can actually keep count of them all. But with particular focus on some of the new factions. Now, there will be a spotlight video out later today that covers a lot of what we're going to talk about here. But it's a nice little 1v1 between the Avari and the Nandan Gorthab faction, which is what I will be talking to you about, not exclusively, but primarily today. We're also going to cover some things like the state of campaign and kind of where we're at with that right now. The release date of the new patch, as that's a question that I get quite a lot, and today I can actually give you a very tentative potential release date. I stress that. I stress the tentative portion of that. But there's also some other big announcements to make. New factions will be adding to our multiplayer docket for a total of 17 available in multiplayer, although our factions available in campaign are going to remain unchanged. So there's going to be, I think, about 14 or 15 factions available for solo play in the Grand Campaign, a little bit less in the War of Wrath campaign, but multiplayer will be going up to 17, all of them with their own unique rosters, playstyles, and all of that fun stuff. It's also a good time to mention that we have a tournament coming up. That is going to be in November. Currently, our prize pool is about $500. That's being provided by myself. We will potentially open up private donations for that in the near-ish future, but there'll be more details about that coming up soon. In any case, let's take a look at some of the newest additions to the mod. We're going to start with the more cosmetic things, and that is going to be, of course, the Avari faction. We're going to talk about them, then we'll move into Nandan Gorthab. The Avari, for those of you currently unaware, are one of our new factions being added to multiplayer. This is a faction that we had initially intended to just simply be a minor reskin, potentially of Assyrian, just to help fill out the campaign map. But one of our devs felt very strongly about moving forward with this faction as its own fully fledged multiplayer entity, and so that's what we've done. The Avari tend to focus on light infantry, ambush, mid-range combat, but they've also got some fairly unique units that we have borrowed from the beginning of the End Times mod. The tree units function fairly similarly, I would say, in principle to the woodland spirits of the Avari. That being said, there are some differences there. Thorncasters here are a very strong mid-range unit that can be fabulous, just simply fabulous, for tanking harassment javelins or just incoming missile fire, really, which takes a lot of pressure off of the Avari. And you can't ignore them because they hit hard enough at a distance that you really cannot just pretend that they're there and focus on something else. So it's really, I wouldn't say a linchpin of Avari builds, but it is definitely a core unit that has a lot of uses. You'll be seeing plenty of them on the battlefield in the near future when I manage to get a few more battles up on the channel. Next, we have the Thorned Ancients of Taur Im Dwyneth. I suppose I better just show you the models of all this stuff in game, hey? We'll do all of their light infantry first, and then we'll do the specialists. Yeah, I think you guys probably want to see them in game. While we're here, we'll cover some of the newer cosmetic things as well, which I don't even think my testers have had a chance to see yet. And there we are. Well, it's taking its time. It likes to do this, especially when you're on stream and you're on a bit of a schedule. Alright, so let's line up the tree units. We'll line up all of their mid-tiers. Mid-tier elven units specifically. Legendary company. Bodyguards. High tiers. Alright, now before I get into this, let's take a look at chat and see what's going on in there. Avari Stu was like, oh, Argus, help me. It's really good to see Argus in the channel here. So a lot of the work was done on this by Steward of Dale and Argus, who provided us with some really cool assets that you're going to see quite shortly here. He's also doing music and stuff for the mod, so give the man a big round of applause. He works extremely hard for us, and the quality really does show through. In any case, hello, Revan. Welcome, my guy. Let's take a look at some of these tree monsters here. Again, these come from the Botet mod, so if you are wondering who is behind the animation skeletons and the meshes themselves, that would be the Beginning of the End Times team, who are very generous with what they let people use. And occasionally, I can't remember his name. He's got a tomato in his avatar. He'll drop by, and you can thank him personally. In any case, we have the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth. Let's take a little bit of a look at him. Let's get rid of this. There we go. So the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth was sort of a last-minute addition to the Avari faction because they don't really have a lot of ranged ability. They are quite weak to skirmishing and cavalry, two things that are actually quite powerful in the mod at the moment. So this is a bit of a shift back towards that kind of infantry and more lighter armor focus, which is what we originally started out with in Silmarillion Total War. So the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, currently missing his little picture here, but it is a living artillery piece. You can see him, already starting to shoot there. Unfortunately, we can't give elephants animations, and I don't think we can do much more with this firing animation. So it does sort of sound like a cannon going off, which is kind of cool. But also a little bit immersion breaking for some. So you'll simply have to get used to it. There's not much that I can do currently about that. But it is a living artillery piece. It does throw rocks, so it is kind of that Ent rock thrower archetype, I guess, that people have been asking about for a very long time. It makes a very nice sort of standing pillar that the rest of the Avari can rally around, and it can also be sort of the linchpin of your builds. I did post the original Avari showcase battle with me playing a double grandfather build, so that is a possibility. You can fit them in and still have around 10,000 or so left from your budget to throw down on infantry and supporting units and so forth. Very powerful, not armor piercing in melee. I know many people are curious as to why that might be, but sometimes for gameplay it is important to have these distinctions in order to keep a singular unit from becoming far more powerful and just generally useful than I would prefer it to be. So high armor, as you'd expect from many elephant units, can be attacked in a fairly large radius, not armor piercing, but its projectile is super disruptive. Might be able to get over there. Yep, you can see, I think a lot of these guys just got knocked over here. And that's going to be a lot of Tollen Gorthab units, but don't worry, we're going to get to them in just a moment. Moving on now to where I was at with the Thorned Ancients of Toward Duinath. Get a good look at the model there. These are going to come again from Botet. And the purpose of this unit is to act as a sort of, as many of the tree units like the Grandfather often will be, sort of a sturdy bastion for the rest of the relatively fragile Avaran units to rally around. They have a lot of HP. They don't do a lot of damage. Notice that their attack is only about 10. Their melee defense is pretty decent, but this is a unit that's going to be surrounded most of the time, so it's going to largely rely on its 12 armor value in order to keep itself alive. 12 armor and the 8 HP are kind of the big draw of this unit. They can be very sturdy, but they can also be quite vulnerable. They are technically, for the purposes of game mechanics, classified as an infantry unit. And so things like cavalry, lancers especially, because they will chunk through that armor like nobody's business with their armor-piercing charge, can be a particular nuisance. And again, that really does kind of hammer home the Avari's weakness to cavalry. That being said, they are not completely helpless. We're going to talk about why once we move into the elven units. Over here, we're going to be using the Dryad model to represent sort of lesser species of horn. Again, these are the Thorncasters. We've already covered them, but that's what they look like. And that's their stat breakdown right there. So all of these units, with the exception of the Grandfather, who can't actually have a shield value, being an elephant, have a passive missile resistance value in addition to their higher armor. So very, very hard to shoot them down. They do kind of compensate somewhat for that very obviously baked in Avari weakness. Next up, we're going to start with the Stone Hewers here. So the aesthetic of the Avari, I can't remember. I think pretty sure it was Stewart of Dale's direction on this, and the rest of us just sort of supported him. But the idea was to have something that's very wild, very in tune with the dark forest in which they abide, and to be very unlike any of the other units that we've really done before. Now, I wasn't involved in this, but I believe some of the texture assets and things like that come from Elder Scrolls Total War, the body in particular. I think the mask for this, I don't think Argus actually did this one, but I believe the mask for this comes from potentially the troll units and things like that. But in any case, these Stone Hewers are obviously a light infantry unit. The purpose behind them is to be just sort of shock infantry. So one of the things that the Avari do quite well, as I mentioned, is ambushing, and they get some particular bonuses to their charge bonus, which is why it is so high. So 19 off the charge is pretty good. Their cost is quite low, and like many other light infantry, they are very, very swift as well. So they can catch you unawares, really hit you hard, and trade pretty nicely with your with whatever you decide to throw them against, assuming that it's not too heavily armored, and that even their formidable attack strength will not be able to penetrate it. Like many of the Avari, they get bonuses in the woods. They're also experts at hiding in woods, so it's not easy to suss them out. And they have pretty good morale, but like many of the Avari units, they are kind of unused to combat. That's one of the features that we wanted to bring forward with them, is that they are fierce and brave, but still a little bit unused to the rigors and the horrors of open war, as, say, some of the Noldor factions, the House of Finarfin, Fingolfin, etc. Pardon me. So their morale response is not the highest. It is possible to hit them with a morale shock that even their high morale scores can't support, and they will be forced to flee. But yeah, ultimately a very efficient unit, one that I'm personally very fond of. Not everyone agrees with that. I will throw that out there so far. Some people don't see too much use for the Stone Hewers, but I think that they're awesome, and they're kind of the core of a lot of builds that I bring. Next, we're going to move on to the next light infantry unit here. These are the Battle Wards of the Darkling Woods. Now, the mask for these ones I know was done by Argus, as were the shields, and I think he provided the spear as well. I could be mistaken. But ultimately, the unit concept and a lot of it was done by Stewart of Dale. So this is their light spear unit, and one of their few dedicated means of dealing with cavalry. Recently, as in the very last patch, certain spear units have gotten some extra bonus specifically against horsemen, and I'll talk about why later, just remind me. And they've gotten a little bit faster. All light infantry have gotten a little bit faster, and that's to help zone out cavalry, especially heavy cavalry from the Sons of Feanor, and a lot of the other like fast-moving cavalry that can be so decisive in a lot of the multiplayer games that I've played recently and that you will hopefully see in the near future. Bonuses in the woods as well. Obviously, they have a substantial bonus against cavalry. They can make a shield wall, and they have very high morale as well. I believe they clock in at about 19 morale with that normal response. They're very, very cheap. They're dirt cheap. In fact, you can bring up to 6 of them before a red price increase, and their melee defense is very, very high. This is the kind of thing that you're going to want to saturate your line with. I don't think there is a single functional Avaran build that doesn't include these guys in some way. They're quick, they are cheap, and they're one of the only defenses that you have, your first and last line, really, against cavalry units. Next, we're going to move on to another unit here, and I believe Argus helped in the creation of this as well. These are the Moss Stalkers of the Stalkers of the Darkling Woods. They are a light bowman, as you have probably guessed. They do have a tiny, tiny shield. It's a little bit hard to see it because it blends in. It's actually kept on their hip, just along their green sash there. But these are poison arrow units. Ignore that. We're still in the process of replacing a lot of these things. But yeah, they fire poison arrows. They have a minor shield value. They use clubs in melee, so they have a little bit of armor piercing. That's something that the Avari do also lack, at least in a very strong way. They have a couple of armor piercing units. One of them's quite good, but with a lower attack value, and the other one is, of course, this unit here. Bonuses in the woods. Unlike other factions who their like lighter mid-tier archers will take penalties when fighting against cavalry, the Moss Stalkers do not. So they're always fighting at full strength against cavalry. Not necessarily a counter, but these things all are iterative, right? They build upon each other. So the Bow Wards, the Moss Stalkers, and some of the other units that you're going to see are really, really important parts of dealing with cavalry and sort of compensating for that weakness in a way that doesn't eliminate it entirely. But yeah, so they have poison arrows. Will deal a little bit of morale damage from range. They are capped at 4, so you can bring quite a lot of them. Although I find that about 3 is the sweet spot, because the 680 gold that it costs to bring them does add up quite quickly. And that's going to do for the mid-tier roster for the elves of the Avari so far. Let's check chat here. I'm sure we have some questions. Are the Stone Hewers expensive? I imagine they are line infantry. They're not that expensive. They're only about 590. Let's see here. No questions so far. By all means, guys, pop your questions, your inquiries, etc., hopes, your dreams into the chat there, and I will address them in a moment. But now we're going to move on to the legendary company, the Host of the Withered Ash. And again, Argus contributed to this one, and I believe the rest of the unit was made by Steward of Dale. But I think there are also some assets from the Elder Scrolls Total War mod in here as well. And the spear, I believe, we use elsewhere. But I think it comes from Botan. But yeah, this is the Host of the Withered Ash. This is the legendary company, and they are sort of a two-handed, more armored, but more or less unshielded variant of the Bow Ward. They are quite quick, especially for a spear wall unit, which we generally keep a little bit slower because of how fast the spear wall animation can cause things to move. But the Avari don't really fight in the typical way, so that doesn't matter as much for them. See if I can get a little bit of a closer look at them there. You guys can enjoy that while I give you the spiel. They are a two-handed spear unit. They have that spear wall formation, but when you pop them out of that, I believe they also have the ability to hide anywhere. I could be wrong. Question mark. Oh, that's fine. It's just being slow, because it's in super slow motion. But I believe they can also hide everywhere. At the very least, they can hide in forests. Unlike other polearm units, they do not take penalties in the forest, because that would be a little bit counterintuitive for the Avari, who, for the rest of their roster, they're trying to pick those fights in the woods. They also have substantial bonuses against cavalry, monsters, that kind of thing. Whereas the battle guards are probably better suited for fighting cavalry. I would say that the Host of the Withered Ash are one of your best defenses against large monsters. And that's going to go hand in hand with some of the other units. But I would say that, yeah, when it comes to melee and wanting to tie things down, the Host of the Withered Ash are kind of where you want to go. Most of our legendary companies are capped at 1. However, the Host of the Withered Ash, because of the sort of smaller roster that the Avari have, and because of the price as well, and as an investment if you decide to bring 2 of them, you will be able to bring a grand total of 2 of this legendary company unit, which is fairly anomalous among legendary companies in Silmarillion and Total War. It occurred to me that not everyone may know what a legendary company is. Vaguely analogous to some of the Warhammer Regiments of Renown, legendary companies offer a little bit of extra functionality and help kind of tie the factions into the world of Middle-earth. In the case of the Host of the Withered Ash, because there's literally nothing about the Avari, that's just a wholesale creation on our part. But there are other units in the mod, like the Host of... Is it the Host? Yes, I believe it's the Company of Prince Gwyndor, who are obviously tied to a character who existed, who fought in battles like Nirnaeth or Noithiad, and who would later become part of Turin's journey. He has his own unit, and he is, of course, present with his own unique model in that. So that's kind of what legendary companies are. In any case, moving on. One of the other notable features of the Host of the Withered Ash is the fact that they're locked morale. I think it's one of three, because the grandfather is locked as well. Thorn Agents and the Host of the Withered Ash are all locked morale units. Can be makes it a little bit difficult to get rid of the Avari, and somewhat balances out the sort of potentially fragile morale of some of the other units, at least in terms of their morale response. They can be easy to shock and drive off, and they'll later reform if you don't run them down, but the Host of the Withered Ash are very sturdy indeed. Perhaps not in terms of combat stats, but it is difficult to get rid of them, especially when there's two of them on the field. It can be a real big hurdle. In any case, that's the Host of the Withered Ash, the legendary company for the Avari. Let's take a look at the first refusers. Now, very Skyrim-esque, right? I believe some of the assets for this come from Elder Scrolls Total War, although the mask itself, reminiscent of some of those Dragon Priest masks from Skyrim, I believe was made by Argus and potentially textured by him. I think he's still down in the chat, though, so he can certainly correct me on that. One of the important things to note about the first refusers, which is one of the 2 bodyguard picks for the Avari, is that they're actually a poison sling unit, but they're a little bit different. So they have a slightly stronger morale debuffing effect. They also have this like big cloud that erupts whenever their projectile hits things, and they, I believe, frighten enemies as well. So one of the other features that we should talk a little bit about in the Avari and in the Nandan Gorthab faction as well is that they make a little bit more liberal use of fear. So fear bombing is a potential thing. I believe the grandfather also causes fear. So using him in tandem with the first refusers can be enough to shock at least lesser trained units into turning and fleeing, which is going to be very useful if you're fighting against, I don't know, a faction like, say, Angband, or some of the Tollen Gorthab units, or something that's just trying to swarm you with mid-tiers and lower quality troops. That can be one of the strategies that you can employ to counteract that somewhat. They're also relentless, and they have quite high melee defense as well. They've got that bark skin missile resist that some of the other tree units have, just to sort of represent how closer they are than the rest of the Avari, being some of the first of the Avaran elves who awoke around the waters of the Lake of Cuivenin? I can't really pronounce it very well. But yeah, so they are ancient, in tune with the land, and I think that's kind of reflected in the fact that they're faceless, behind that mask of like wood. You don't really see much of their body. They're sort of just encased in wooden armor and just very much in tune with the element that they've chosen to live in. So that's the first refusers there. Their sling pellet is also armor piercing. I feel like that goes without saying at this point. Next, we have the second bodyguard option. These are the Shades of the Guarded Path, and I actually got to help write a lot of the lore for this faction, so if you guys have questions about that, let me know. But this one I actually really like, because I think it's a very noble sacrifice. So, the Shades of the Guarded Path are the chieftain's bodyguard. Yes, they are the bodyguards of the chieftains of the Avaran tribes. They, as their name would suggest, are, in a sense, dead men walking. The Eldar live forever, however the Shades only live for as long as their chieftain is alive. Once he has, if he has either fallen in battle or to some of the horrors potentially that drift into Tawarim Dwinath, then they will also eventually take their own lives, which I think is a more powerful gesture when you're the Eldar and you live forever. Giving up your immortality, your bliss, your time in Middle-earth, out of respect, loyalty, love for your chieftain. I personally find that very... It's noble, it's tragic, and it's a little bit dark, so definitely fitting for the Halloween season. They have these bright masks here. I believe some of them were made specifically for the unit, and I think at least one variant of it does come from the Boten mod. But I know Argus worked on some of these masks and on texturing them, and they obviously look fabulous. I think it's this one right here that sort of looks like the voodoo mask from the Witch Doctor in Diablo 3. I think that's the one that he had a hand in creating. But again, unit was designed, and the concept for it was done by Stewart of Dale. But the Shades of the Guarded Path hit like trains. 15 attack, 14 charge means that they will annihilate just about anything that gets in their way. They are one of the more armored units for the Avari, the other one being the Host of the Withered Ash, and of course the Tree Spirits. But as far as the Elves go, 6 armor is about as good as it gets. They've got 11 defensive skill, they've got a solid shield value of 7, so unlike most of the other Avari units, it's not easy to shoot these guys down from range, especially if you're just using your sort of stock standard archers, 5 damage and below. The Shades of the Guarded Path, more than capable of standing up to that, and yeah, that's them. They're capped at 2, they hit like trucks, but they're fairly straightforward. Unlike some of the other Avari units, there's not a whole lot there that's unknown about them. Next, we're going to move on to some of the high tiers, but before I do that, let's take a quick break here and check the chat. Love the company of Prince Gwendor unit. Yeah, they are one of my favorites as well. They're very ostentatious, very... What's the word I'm looking for? Cocksure. What about the special black armor that one of the Avari could make? That one was killed by the King of Gondolin. Does he not feature here? If you're referring to Aeol, we don't have a model in here for Aeol, as these fellows would habitate in Tower Imduinath, which is in the southeast of Middle-earth, which I believe takes them a little bit out of the way from Nan Elmoth, which is where Aeol would live. He was less of a faction, I suppose, and more of just an individual who lived with some servants out in the woods. It's possible that you will see units for Aeol come to campaign, so like around Nan Elmoth, if you were not Noldor, maybe for the maybe available to the Elves of Doriath, something like that. That's a discussion we'll definitely have, because campaign will feature a ton of units, things that much like the legendary companies kind of help tie you into the world and pull you into the fantasy and just sort of make you feel, I suppose, like you're actually, you know, present in the setting, as much as we're able to. In any case, what's my favorite Avari unit? We're about to look at my favorite Avari unit right now. But I think that's all for questions so far. They look very woody elves. Yes, that was kind of more or less the intention there. There's definitely some parallels I think that people will, especially with the woodland spirits, coming from a Warhammer mod, draw with the Avari. We didn't really want to make them, you know, a copy of the Avari, so they're a little bit more mid-range focused, and other things like that. And they have some pretty cool custom lore. In any case, let's move on now. Take a look at the Rangers of the Hidden Path. Now, it bears mentioning that there is sort of a cultural concept that we've come up with for the Avari, and you're going to see that like reflected in some of the units. So the Hidden Path is not necessarily a martial path, but sort of a cultural concept. The Avari survive by keeping themselves hidden, and the Rangers of the Hidden Path are very much the embodiment of that. They're a unit that can hide anywhere. They're also monster hunters, as you can tell from these masks and stuff that they're wearing. Makes them look very fierce. But the idea there is just striking from surety, not just in, you know, warfare, but also in the way that they navigate the tribal complexities of the society that they've built for themselves in the woods of Towden Duinath. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But the Rangers of the Hidden Path, this is the premier monster hunting unit for the Avari. They wield 2 daggers in close quarters. In terms of the Silmarillion stat system, the implications for that are that they have very low damage, very high melee defense, but they're also armor piercing, so it is quite nice. Their melee attack clocks in at about 8. You can upgrade that with an attack upgrade, which I believe actually raises it by 3, so you can get them up to 11, which is pretty respectable. Very high melee defense, meaning that it's not easy to crush them with a cavalry charge if you do find them. But their low armor value and lack of a shield, only 4, makes them extremely vulnerable to missiles. They've got a little bit of extra ammunition over other hunter class javelins, Again, for those of you unfamiliar with the nomenclature, we have different distinctions of javelins in the mod. One such is hunter javelins, and they are used for preying upon heavy infantry, slow-moving targets, elephants, monsters. It's one of the things that we use to prevent our monsters from just running roughshod over everything. So the Rangers of the Hidden Path, potentially very, very deadly, especially because they can hide anywhere. So you need to be aware when you're playing as the Avari, when these guys decide to show themselves. If you have any monsters in the area, you're gonna want to know about it and potentially move them out of the way, or shut them down with missiles, flank them with infantry, that sort of thing. But yeah, they've got a really cool mask here, which I personally find terrifying. It's very Wendigo-esque with the antlers, and I've spent a lot of time in the woods lately listening to creepy podcasts, so Wendigos terrify me. And I thought that would be a cool thing to, maybe bring into the mod, because it is so intimidating, and that's one of the features of the Avari. They have these terrifying war masks that sort of represent creatures from the place that they come from, but are also again tying them into the natural world. So Rangers of the Hidden Path, pretty cool. Moving on now to the Gloom Hunters. It's harder to see their mask. They've got, I think, 3 or so variants, all of which have this sort of sorceress, green lit Celtic knots and elegant swirls and stuff on them. The Gloom Hunters of the Trackless Dark, which is one of the areas inside of Taurim Dwinath. I will eventually release a map. I've drawn up a map because I'm a nerd and that's what I do. But this is one of the areas where you can potentially find rogue horns whose hearts have turned black, or some of the brood of Ungoliant who have crept down into here, orcs and things like that. There may even end up being in campaign a small outpost of the Nandan Gorthab faction down here, just to kind of spice up the area, but also give the player something else to tackle and add a little bit of flavor to that area of the world. But the Gloom Hunters of the Trackless Dark are potentially a very scary unit. They have a bonus versus cavalry. They have glaives as well, which are particularly useful for dealing with mounted opponents, but also with elephants. So this is another potential anti-elephant unit, one that's a little bit more melee focused rather than the Rangers of the Hidden Path, who prefer to deal their damage from a safe distance of around 80 meters, quote-unquote safe. They're also relentless. I don't know if I mentioned that already, so it's quite hard to knock them over. And they don't get staggered as well. So elephants that move through them, the way that you can currently kind of do it, you can stagger things when you walk through them with those high mass elephant units. That is not going to apply to the Gloom Hunters of the Trackless Dark. So you can definitely want to be aware of how you decide to address this unit with a lot of options in the game. That being said, quite lightly armored, no shield value, and their sort of base attack there is only about 11. You can buff that up to about 14, which makes them fairly respectable as shock infantry, gives you a little bit more flexibility as well, but it does increase their price to nearly 1,000. And because it is a unit with relatively simple counters, train some bow units on them, as a player of the Avari, you need to be aware of when you decide to bring this unit out, and where you place them, even at the beginning of the map in deployment. That might be something to cover in a deployment video in the future, because it is very important in Silmarillion Total War generally, but in Silmarillion Total War, we have a lot of mechanics at play that make knowing where you want to put units and having them, in place, 10 steps ahead, kind of, is very important and potentially a game-changing thing. So yeah, that's the Gloom Hunters of the Trackless Dark. Another really cool unit by Stewart of Dale and Argus. And now we move on. This is one of my favorite units in the Avari. Not quite as big a favorite as the Rangers of the Hidden Path. These are the Branch Stalkers of the Green Sea. And the Green Sea conceptually is sort of the outer borders of Taurim Dwinath, this very expansive forest. Much like an ocean, all the trees and stuff starts to kind of blend together, just like waves out on the big sea. And so, poetic license has been named the Green Sea. And these are roving bands of warriors who are sort of a more elite border defense, sort of a proactive a proactive defense against interlopers into Avaran territory. In terms of game mechanics, they've got a minor deflection bonus. That's a fairly recent development. That's where the shield comes from, even though they do a wield. That's a fairly recent development, something that we're kind of trying out for the time being. Again, it goes without saying, stats are not final. But that's just to kind of help them be a little bit more useful in more Avaran builds. They've got an alright defense score of 14, which is pretty good considering that they dual wield axes. But they've also got that very low armor score of 5, making them potentially very easy to shut down with missiles. They've got a solid missile attack. They throw daggers, which will do quite a lot of damage. The fact that it's 10 isn't really reflective of the weapon itself, but rather more of a gameplay practicality. Previously, they had 4 shots of a lower damage projectile, but because this is a unit that is melee oriented, that seemed a little bit counterintuitive. So now they've got 2. They can quickly toss them, deal around the same amount of damage as they would have, just do it more quickly, and then charge into battle. They also frighten nearby enemy infantry, which is very, very useful, and again plays into that sort of more fear focus for the Avari. But yeah, it's not the most complex of units. You throw your projectiles, you throw them in. They're great chaff grinders, but of course they are quite vulnerable to missiles. Cavalry as well, although if they manage to countercharge a unit of cavalry, you can trade relatively well, but even lower end lancers will be able to overwhelm that 14 melee defense with their high charge bonuses and really put the hurt onto your branch stalkers of the Green Sea. So if you can, hide them behind a unit of battle wards, hide them in with a unit of battle wards if you so please. But yeah, definitely need to be aware about the relative fragility of a lot of these high-end units. That being said, they hurt, they hit hard off the charge, and a lot of them are able to hide anywhere. So you're able to kind of pick and choose the moment that you decide to reveal them. And up until that point, your enemies are really going to have no idea what sort of high-tier units you've decided to bring, or if you decided to bring any of them, which, as I play more and more Silmarillion, it is important to know that mind games are a real big part of the way that multiplayer can play out, especially when you're playing with factions that have a lot of hidden units, like the Avari, for example, or Siriand, or many of those other things. And now, as a brief intermission, I want to show off some new models that we were given by Castellan. I did a little bit of retexturing for these, and this is the new upgrade model for the Gijak Skaraz units. But we'll talk about that in a second. I'm just going to let you sort of focus on what these guys look like, and we'll see if there's any more questions. Lots of tree boys. I missed those. Could you zoom over the models after you've wrapped up? Absolutely. So this here is going to be the Thorned Ancients, sort of a tanky, high HP, high armor, but still mechanically infantry unit for the Avaran Elves. Very useful for kind of taking hits for other things, or for mixing in with stuff to just give things a little bit extra oomph. One of the potentially not thought about uses of these is, even if you're, say you're losing combat, even if you've got branch stalkers of the Green Sea, this unit over here, and you've got Thorned Ancients in there as well, it's important to note that the very presence of these guys and the fact that they're hitting things and not dying in return does have a implication for combat calculations. So if the branch stalkers on their own would be evenly matched, or they'd be losing, and you throw these guys in there, that is going to make them, for the purposes of game calculations, even if they would lose in the long run, they will temporarily be winning that combat, which also has a morale penalty which stacks with the fear. And the fact that they can push through things and get behind stuff also means that they can attack things from behind, which has more morale penalties. So mechanically, the way that these things work synergizes really, really nicely with a lot of the other Avaran units and mechanics. So that's something to bear in mind. Use them as a goon squad, and you can potentially route things off, especially if maybe, I don't know, because they are locked morale, you can use them in tandem with the first refusers and not have to worry about routing off your own units. So the fear from the refusers and their poison damage, plus these guys and all of the mechanics that I just talked about, it all kind of comes together into a really nice cohesive whole. So yeah, kind of cool. Anyway, we'll quickly zoom over these, and then I'll look through some more questions, and then we'll take a look at the new toll models, and then we can move on to the Avari of the Avari, the horrors of Nandan Gorthab. which I'm really excited because I got to design that faction basically from the ground up. Yeah, Thorncasters here. This is sort of a, think of it as a javelin unit, a mid-range supremacy unit. It very much is, and kind of firmly cements the Avari in, on the stage of the multiplayer as that like mid-range powerhouse faction when it comes to their missiles. So they're there. And then I feel like Windy will really enjoy this because Windy's a smart guy, and there's a lot of creative applications for a unit like the Grandfather of Deepwood Hearth. Now, it is a living artillery piece. We're going to see more of those in the Nandan Gorthab faction. High armor, doesn't currently have AP, mostly as a matter of gameplay preference. But yeah, it's also a big old tanky tree man. And has a cool name. I did the names for this faction. Just saying, they're pretty awesome. In any case, moving on now. We have the Gijak Skataz. Now, it is worth noting that this is the Gundabad Guard created by Castellan, who is one of our developers, but also works on many different projects. He has his fingers in many different cookie jars. Super talented guy, really fun to work with. He's awesome. I will potentially include links to his Discord and his mod descriptions and all the things he works on, but one of the main things is DAC, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But in any case, these are the Gijak Skataz armor upgrades. The idea here being that they now very much look the part as being kind of the core of Sauron's Tollen Gorthab armies. They're fairly low in number. They do have inspiration, and they have better equipment than most of the other units in the roster. And I personally like to think of them as sort of an early experiment, an early step rather, in the process of creating Black Uruks. That would later be copied by Saruman to create the Urukai. And I think that's not only logical, but also a cool way of tying in the first age to all of the subsequent ages, and even other things in the modding sphere. So that's pretty cool. Gijak Skataz chosen here. Otherwise, in terms of statistics, they are unchanged. Over here, we've got the Wolf Guards. You can see those nasty-looking maces in their hands there. And they've got those blackened skulls of their victims. The purpose of the armor, if you're wondering why it is so bombastic and orangey, is because Tollen Gorthab is very much a flame-focused faction. Fire is often tied into sorcery, such as when Saruman uses whatever trick it is he uses to blow up the walls at Helm's Deep. Gunpowder, sorcery, some mixture of the two. Sauron himself, also associated with fire, the Mountain of Fire, things like that. And many of the Tollen Gorthab units, such as the Hishbukraz clan, all use fiery projectiles. Ash Priests, Pyre Wolves, etc., etc. They also have access to the Mangonel. So this is just sort of tying into that overall theme of the Tollen Gorthab army, which, if you guys are wondering what the lore basis for that is, there's none. It's whole cloth creation. I can go into Tollen Gorthab at a later date in depth about what we've done with all the factions and what kind of the lore is. Sauron himself, sexy bastard. Sort of copying Morgoth a little bit. Don't mind the fact that there's a general right there. Generally, you shouldn't put your general into Sauron. It's kind of a waste. But yeah, so he's sort of copying Morgoth. He's got that towering Dark Lord look. But in this iteration of the patch, he also has a limited missile attack. Very similar to the way that the Uruloki projectile works. It is also, surprise, surprise, a flame-based projectile. In terms of mechanics, all flame-based projectiles have relatively decent, pushing into the upper end of damage for missiles, but they do not have armor piercing. So things like the dwarves, for example, who very famously were resistant to flame, that's one of the ways that we're going about representing that. So fire projectiles have been included in the mod, basically with the dwarves in mind. And how it works mechanically and how it interacts with our stat system has kind of been planned out for a while. But yeah, he has a flame projectile now. Quite useful because of the mortar-like nature of it. You can fire it and arc it over your troops as they engage, which is fairly intuitive with the way that Tollen Gorthab likes to play. Next over here, we've got the Gijak Skataz Zagulkalab, otherwise known as their Gijak Skataz Warg Riders. Similar models to the others. They've also got a little bit of a sword there. You can really get up close and you can sort of see the details. If you look into their eyes there, although I don't recommend you do it for too long, you may lose yourself in them. They have a bit of a glow effect, just a little bit of Photoshop trickery, basically to sort of give the impression that they have these glowing ember eyes. The upgraded Gijak Scadas are obviously something you have to invest quite heavily in, not just in terms of, game mechanics. When you purchase them or upgrade them, upgrades for Tollen Gorthab are quite expensive, being away from the military machine of Angband. So you're going to spend about 120 extra gold on this unit. And I also wanted to represent that as sort of them growing closer to Sauron, which is why they go from their original model as just being these sort of like more heavily armored Orcish warriors and the rest of the horde that surrounds them, to being this more professional looking force. Because you're investing more in them, think of it as Sauron investing more in them, right? So they have better armor, but also like they get these burning coal eyes as they become closer to the master that they worship. Yeah, on their back there, I don't know if we mentioned it, they've got these sort of charred skulls of their victims as well. Again, all alluding to that sort of flame, theme in Tollen Gorthab. So now, a really cool core to the Tollen Gorthab armies stands out a little bit. Again, part of the orange was to sort of differentiate them from like the very muted black and brown tones. This is a much more saturated orange. Now they're really going to stand out in the Tollen Gorthab army. You're going to notice them, and you're going to be like, hey, maybe I should kill them. In any case, that's going to do for the Avari and for the little surprise preview there for Tollen Gorthab. Let's take a look at Nandan Gorthab. Go back to the Dimbar map. It's usually a good one. And we're just going to bring all of the things. Now, I will mention that this is still a work in progress, and there are some things that will yet be changed. Do the mid tiers here. All the weird shit can go first. And then we'll do these lads. There we go. And there's a lot of borrowings from Botet in here as well. Like a lot. In any case, before we hop into the game, let's take a look and see if there's any additional questions or comments and things like that. Can you remember what amount of armor that upgrade actually will give the Red Boys? It gives them +2. So they go from, I think it's 9 or 10 to either 11 or 12. One of those. Real facts, though, the Avari are coming along very nicely. Keep up the great work. I honestly, thank you, Glor from Nell. I appreciate that. However, I can't really take a lot of credit for that, because as I mentioned, a lot of our assets do come from Botet, and Steward of Dale was the one who led the charge on this. I was perfectly fine to let the Avari just sort of be a minor faction, maybe even just a reskin of Asturian, but it was his insistence that kind of pushed us towards doing this. So big thanks to him. I'm very stubborn, as anybody who's worked with me can certainly attest. But Steward of Dale, yeah, been a good case, and here we are. Now we have a glorious new faction, and I definitely don't regret the decision. So monsters are there. Tinier beasties are going to be right here. Light orc units are going to be here. Bodyguards are here. Did I take 2 of them? I definitely took 2 of them. That's fine. And then sort of cavalry and things like that can be right there. I took 2 of the Blood Gorgers. I must really like them. I do, actually. That's very true. Alright. Get ourselves set up there. Let's start with the derpiest one right now. Now, I want to preface this by saying that we're going to talk about a couple of things first. Conceptually, Nandan Gorthab is another more fear-based faction, but it's also our first monster faction. Of course, we have Angband, but the way that they go about approaching war really hinges around large numbers, heavy armor, with the support of some really strong monsters, but they're infantry blocks on their own. Like, you can field a full infantry-based Angband army, whereas I feel, unless you have a really good teammate or something like that, you would struggle very, very hard as Nandan Gorthab if you tried to just lean exclusively into the Orcish units. A lot of the Angband monsters as well being sort of extensions of the will of the Dark Lord of Middle Earth. They're locked morale. You can't get rid of them. But the Angband monsters have some different mechanics. So some of them can rout, some of them can run amok. Actually, all of the spider units can run amok. And there's also statistical differences as well. That's some of the things that I've sort of baked in behind the scenes. But the most interesting part about Nandan Gorthab is that, as far as I know, they are unique among Lord of the Rings Orcs factions in that they're actually really good at skirmishing. They don't necessarily have incredible range, but they do have really good numbers, quite good accuracy. They've got, you know, a decent amount of damage, probably the highest damage of any of the Orcish archers, which generally tend to fall in the 2 to 3 damage range. The orcs that we're going to see actually have 5, which puts them on par with a lot of other units. They don't have elven accuracy by any means, but yeah, pretty good. And they have some Spider Rider archers who are actually very, very good, and they have quite high missile damage as well. There's also a lot of projectiles here. You're probably noticing a lot of blue bars down at the bottom. So it is the only orc faction that could really go skirmish heavy, without having to, like, you know, meme or put a real fine point on it, like, oh, I'm Angband and I brought 10 thralls, that kind of thing. Nandan Gorthab can kind of do that on the regular, and be very, very comfortable in doing so, and still have lots of money left over for doing other things at the same time. So that's kind of how they differentiate themselves from Angband. They really only have one heavy infantry unit, which is just a really cool model, and I kind of wanted to include it anyway so that they're not railroaded, because that's one of the things that I try not to do with factions. Is I don't want to, like, railroad people into one style, but you also need to balance that against the fact that factions need to have distinctly contoured strengths and weaknesses. In any case, so monsters, missiles, lots of mobility, and a large amount of lighter infantry, some of which are lock morale, so they provide excellent tar pits and support for the main course, as it were. So as I was saying, let's start with the derpier of the units. Now, this unit is currently having a converter issue, so it looks thoroughly ridiculous. The model, I believe, is a Chaos Giant model that comes from Botet as well, which the Botet team was kind enough to give me permission to use. Had a chance to talk to him, Morton Doof, super nice guy. Also offered me some extra animations and stuff, so we may see that filter in to the mod a bit later. But yeah, its UVs are messed up, so it is truly an abomination. And the Udrush abomination is one of the nameless things, which I was really, really excited to kind of sink my teeth into a little bit. Because the nameless things they're just that. They're nameless, and it's a really good opportunity to kind of expand, I guess, what's possible or what's acceptable within Tolkien's Middle Earth. So because they are unnamed by design, they can literally take almost any kind of form, no matter how horrifying, blasphemous, or potentially even mundane, although I suppose I suspect rather it gravitates towards the latter two types of just being horrible and unknowable. Urush, I actually looked up a Valarin dictionary. It is the Valarin word for fire. And the idea behind this is that I figured nobody but Melian would have either the capacity or the courage to actually name these things for what they are. And so Valarin, not that I'm a big Sapir-Whorf hypothesis person, but would have the functionality, basically, to put a name to something that is unnameable. Making it just Sindarin seemed a little bit mundane. And the idea behind Nandan Gorthab and why it's Melian in particular is because this is a faction that will be on the northern border of Doriath. This is being added in to campaign as well, not as a playable faction, but as sort of an early game danger for Doriath, who otherwise is sort of surrounded by friendly factions. So your only option to do anything would either be fight rebels or kick off another kinslaying immediately. And I realize there are many lore-focused people out there, so this faction was kind of added with you guys in mind, believe it or not. You don't have to feel railroaded and strongly pushed into just attacking elves in your early game as Doriath. And so, that being said, a lot of units in Nandan Gorthab are designed to be challenging for the Doriath roster at least as it exists in the early game. So you're going to have a lot of girdle units, for example, and like lighter infantry and things like that. So there's some flame weaponry, there's like lighter projectiles, and there's, of course, the skirmish nature of them, which is something that Gorthab does sort of struggle with. They don't have the greatest range presence. They're more of a get in close and chop things up kind of faction. So in that way, Nandan Gorthab is kind of their foil, and that is very much by design. So now you've got a formidable early game adversary, something to keep you busy. You've also got the Avari to your south, and then you're going to have some other factions relatively close by that we'll be able to talk about a little bit later. But yeah, the UV on this is messed up. I was up till like 2 o'clock in the morning trying to figure this out, and I cannot. But it will not look so derpy, hopefully, when we manage to release the patch. But in any case, it's a living artillery piece. It shoots fire. In my own custom lore, because it is an abomination that like potentially doesn't really have the same attachment to its body the way that, you know, other sentient races might. It actually tears off chunks of itself and throws them at its enemy, these sort of fulminating, incendiary bits of its own person that it just lobs using its frightening strength across the battlefield. It is a flame projectile, so it's pretty good at disrupting or also hurting light and even potentially medium infantry, depending on the unit. It doesn't have any animations where it sort of reaches in and grabs itself and then lobs it across, but that's unfortunately because it is an elephant class unit and you can't give them firing animations, at least to my knowledge. It also has a special rule that I've invented called Eldritch Horror, which makes it move quite quickly. It's also got a very highly increased red price. So unlike the Grandfather, you're generally not going to be bringing 2 Urush Abominations, and the price tags on a lot of the other units were sort of made with this in mind as well. Most of them being relatively expensive. Not super expensive, but like enough that it sort of plays hand in hand with this. So yeah, it's pretty cool. Let's take a look at his projectile real fast here, and you can sort of see it in action. Yeah, it's the House of the King here. They're barely even going to notice that this exists. And then we'll move on to our next monster unit. I realize we're moving a little bit slower here, but that's just because I'm more familiar with a lot of the lore and the reasoning behind these things. So yeah, there you go. A big fiery doom ball. And it's not going to kill a lot of people, but it's actually very disruptive. So let's see if we can get another like good hit on these guys. Yeah, it's a bit harder when they're moving. Yeah, there you go. So only a couple of models there actually died because of how heavily armored this unit is, but it's extremely disruptive. And because gameplay-wise, this has some implications. So you're going to see a lot of these units get knocked over. Now this unit is being forced to kind of reform as the AI pathfinding is, you know, what it is in Medieval 2. So it might not necessarily kill heavy infantry, but you can sometimes use it as a tool for disruption, which I think is a little cool extra feature. But that was a big long explanation. Maybe we have some questions and stuff in here. I can take a look at the UV map for the model if you send it to me. I absolutely will do that. I suspect that it's a converting issue, as we do also have this issue with the Udurloki. So if you can figure this out, then potentially we can have our Udurloki not look weird and derpy. Let's see. Those models took too long to make. I believe it. Poor Castellan really rakes himself over the coals for our benefit all of the time. So he's down there in chat. You guys should definitely give him a little bit of love, because he certainly deserves it, and he does a huge amount of work for the community. He's, like I said, he's in DAC, he's in Silmarillion, he's contributed to Reforged. I don't think there's a major modding project out there that in some way hasn't benefited from Castellan's work. So, yeah, big high five to that man. Now, let's see here. We're going to move on to the Karangwi Broodmother. And then we'll look at the legendary company counterpart, which is fittingly for Nandan Gorthab, another spider. But yes, the Karangwi Broodmother. This is a sort of a support elephant that can also mix it up in melee. It's got a good amount of HP. It's got decent enough armor. But like many of the other elephants, it does have a very wide radius, and there's lots of counters to elephant units in the mod. So hopefully it's not something that just runs completely roughshod through everything and destroys them. But for Gorthab, this can be a real big early game challenge unit like this. They are mounted on the back by some of the Duso-Manuthan orcs, which in Valarin simply means marred. For those of you for whom English isn't your first language, marred just simply means imperfect, but in the sense that something was done to it to make it imperfect. So the orcs, being sort of, depending on the conception of Tolkien's work and where it is in its development, are either a corrupted version of elves or the corrupted version of men bred with beasts. And don't think on that for too long, because that's a horrifying prospect. So the Marred are, in terms of lore, castaways from Tollen Gorthab, given the relative proximity of those two factions. They would simply take their whatever orcish infants they determined to be undesirable, or just individuals, and abandon them there, or exile them to Nandan Gorthab. And some of them survive, and now they've created their own tribes and societies and banded together, as the orcs tend to do, in order to survive in a harsh and unforgiving world where literally everyone, including their own kind, hates them. Now, they're a little bit more heavily armored than what I want them to be here. This is a model originally intended for only one of the units, which we'll see here. Eventually, they will get an updated one where all of the other orcs are shirtless. I want them to be kind of shirtless berserkers that sort of have just like tacked on bits of armor. Not really a big smithcraft kind of thing here, but potentially a little bit of expertise coming out of some of the tribes of Tollen Gorthab. In any case, the Karangvi Broodmother has a non-armor piercing attack. Again, I realize that flailing limbs and crushing jaws would probably squish you in a suit of armor, and that you could very much consider that to be armor piercing. But I would like to stress that Silmarillion is gameplay focused, and I tend to put gameplay first over other concerns when I can't, have the two act harmoniously in tandem. In any case, they attack relatively slowly compared to the other unit that we're going to look at, but it's still quite quick, as the animations on this unit are they're very rapid. They've got some Duso-Manuthan orcs mounted on their back, which have harassment javelins, do a little bit of damage from range, but largely this is a unit that you're going to want to kind of throw in into melee, not necessarily immediately, but after a little while. They've got a good model counts. There's about 5 of them in every unit. It does, however, have the ability to rout. So fire can be very useful against them, being elephant units. They do have sort of for me, it's an ill-understood penalty against fire units, but I believe it does panic them a little bit more, and can cause them to go amok. But this unit does not go amok, but they are still relatively vulnerable to fire damage and things like that. Yeah, they also cause fear. Many of the Nandan Gorthab units cause fear to one type of unit or another. Again, I recognize that fear bombing can be a really big problem, and that can make people kind of feel cheated or robbed in their multiplayer games, but also be very frustrating in campaign as well, when you lose a match because everything runs away. So I've tried to be thematic, but also very reasonable in our implementation of fear in the Nandan Gorthab faction. So the Karangvi Broodmother, I believe, causes fear specifically to mounts, but for whatever reason that doesn't like to show up in these little descriptions. But they're also pretty good at mixing it up with infantry, because there are so many of them and they do attack in an area. That being said, they can rout. They've only got a normal response to morale, so fire arrows again can be useful for that reason alone, because they can inflict that fear that can potentially cause these units to turn and flee. So yeah, Karangvi Broodmother. If you're curious what Karangvi means, I believe it's like red web or like red maw or something in Sindarin. The spiders are a little bit more easier for the Sindarin elves, I would think, to wrap their heads around. So they have Sindarin names, whereas some of the other units do not. Over here, we have the Hungering Maw. Now, this is the legendary company for Nandan Gorthab, and it's a little bit different from the Karangvi Broodmother in some key ways. It has a wider radius for its tusk, which basically is like the attack radius in front of it. So I believe it kind of goes out in it's like an X or Y axis or something like that. But it's like a small cone in front of it. that can deal damage in. So that's a little bit higher than the Karangri Broodmother. It also attacks much more quickly. When I explain the lore, you'll kind of understand why. One of the other salient features of it is the projectile. So it can spit. Currently, it's just your generic kind of orange fire, but it will eventually be green to represent the fact that it spits its own digestive bile onto you. I believe that there are some spiders that can do something similar to that. I don't know. I'm personally very afraid of spiders. That's just kind of the theme of our last couple of factions. The Wendigo sort of look to the Rangers of the Hidden Path, but also the Nandan Gorthab faction. I am extremely arachnophobic, so this is causing me physical pain right now. But yeah, from what I understand, some spiders do sort of choose to hunt that way, or evolve to hunt that way. And the Hungering Maw is no exception to that. So let's take a look at the stat line here. A little bit more armor, a little bit better melee defense, but obviously the kind of drawback here is that, one, it's much more expensive than the Karangri Broodmother. It's about 150 more, which I guess isn't that much when you're dropping 1,500 on a unit. But it also attacks much more quickly because it is a sort of frenzied monster. So the Hungering Maw lives in the peaks above Nandan Gorthab, sort of a solitary hunter, but it's also hungry. It's definitely inherited its mother Ungoliant's ravenous hunger. And so it will descend from the heights and go on blood-soaked rampages throughout the denizens of the Vale, trapping and melting them and drinking up their tasty juices. Personally, not my preferred method of cooking, but to each their own. I don't want to be discriminatory. But eventually, the other denizens, the other horrifying denizens of Nandan Gorthab have enough, and they will drive the Hungering Maw back up towards the heights. It's obviously very difficult to kill with that 30 armor score, but it can, unlike other units, run amok. So deal enough damage to it, inflict enough pain quickly, and you won't even have to kill it, and it will be forced to flee. And so it will retreat back to the heights, having not quite satiated itself. It got a taste of what it wants, and a taste of the destruction and violence that sort of drives it, but it's never enough, really. And then the cycle repeats again. So it's sort of not necessarily an ancient god of destruction, but I would like to think that the Duso-Manuthan orcs sort of worship it as such. In any case, that is the legendary company for the Nandan Gorthab faction. In terms of mechanics, its projectile is relatively limited because you can only throw up for so long, and it's body piercing, armor piercing, and it's a little bit lower on the missile scale. But that being said, 8 AP and body piercing is actually pretty formidable because in Silmarillion, armor and shield is generally lower across the board. It also causes fear to all units, and it may charge without orders, as once it sees prey, it probably can't help itself. But yeah, so that is the Hungering Maw there. Now we're going to move on to a unit that I believe currently has some bugged alpha textures, and may get a new model coming into the future. But as I mentioned earlier, in some of my downtime, I spend a lot of time camping. I'm very outdoorsy. I like to be out in the woods, and I live in a beautiful place on Vancouver Island, so you kind of can't help but do it. So I spent a lot of time in the woods listening to podcasts about, creatures that inhabit the woods and kidnap people and Bigfoot and things like that, and I sort of came up with the idea of the Devourers of Children, and you'll learn a little bit more about them in a horror short story that I hopefully will be able to release by Halloween. In any case, the Devourers of Children are conceptually, they are sort of a troll that can run away with armor piercing. So most of our trolls in the mod, in fact, I believe all of them currently don't have armor piercing for many different reasons. Again, we can discuss that later. But they are very damage focused and very much Nandan Gorthab writ large. So lightly armored, no shield value, lots of HP, but they don't have the greatest morale response. Their morale isn't super high. But they can hit like absolute trains. There's lots of them, and they have some longevity to them. So they will rout, come back, charge, kill some stuff, rout, come back, and repeat until they have had enough, essentially. But in terms of lore, they are a monster that obviously likes to prey upon the weak, which is despicable no matter who you are. They will prey upon the sort of outlying villages, or anybody really who strays a little bit too close to the borders of Nandan Gorthab, which is where these units tend to live. They've sort of been driven to the outside of the, if you can call it a society, of Nandan Gorthab society, and they're scavengers. They live off what it is that they can get, but somehow managing to retain that very burly, if Neanderthal-esque physique. But yeah, they're relatively expensive at 1,000. They can be routed off. They also have a penalty against cavalry, because again, Nandan Gorthab is another faction that does have some penalties against cavalry. It's a very fine balancing act. I'm currently making some of the other counters to cavalry, the more logical ones, spears and so forth, a little bit better at what they do in order to counteract how strong cavalry has become. But at the same time, we're also doing this because you don't want cavalry to just be like easily shut down and kind of useless, because that has plenty of implications. Anyway, Devourers of Children, lightly armored, quite fast, very, very fast. They can hide in woods. They get a bonus in the woods where they live, and a very deadly charge. And again, much like the Hungering Maw, ill-disciplined, so it is possible that they can charge without orders. And that is going to be the big old beastie lineup for Nandan Gorthab. I realize we're moving quite slowly through this, but hey, I know a lot of people enjoy the lore, and Nandan Gorthab is one of those factions that I kind of had to make all of this stuff up as I went along. So aside from the spiders, not really a whole lot is known about what lived there. In any case, let's take a look at any questions and stuff that we have here. Nothing so far, which is fine. If you guys have any other additional questions, inquiries, and so forth, be sure to pop them in the chat. I love answering questions or comments. Hell, just want to tell us that we're doing a good job. It's always nice to hear that. Next, we're moving on to... I should also mention, this comes from Botet, as does this, as do all of our spiders. So, huge amount of Botet assets into this faction. Yeah. They had exactly what we kind of needed, and they were generous enough to allow us to use them. So, all the credit to the talented modders over there, for both their hard work and for their generosity as well. In any case, we have the Dusa Hunting Pack coming up next here. And they are hunting hounds bred by the Dusa orcs in order to hunt down packs of people travelers or whoever it happens to be that strays into their territory and somehow manages to not get eaten by the Devourers of Children. In terms of gameplay mechanics, they are also an elephant. They have a smaller radius than basically any other elephant, so they're not as easy to hit with missiles or with melee attacks, but all of the other penalties, counters, bonuses, etc., apply to them. Also, as a cute little aside, I love the fact that they're elephants, because elephants can remove stakes, and I like to think of it as this hunting pack just, seeing a big stick and running off happily with it. Chewing through them in fury if you prefer, but I think it's cuter the other way around. In any case, mechanically, they have a minor AoE attack. They also attack extremely fast, but their morale response is probably the lowest. They're probably one of the easiest units in Nandan Gorthab to rout off. That being said, they have armor piercing, a good charge, so as flankers and things like that, they can be very, very effective. Especially when, working in tandem with other units or working in tandem with each other and ambushing or surrounding heavily armored units that can chunk through them quite quickly. Their price tag is not super high, coming in at 725. You can also upgrade their attack a little bit. How you upgrade something Claws and Fangs, I don't know. Again, another gameplay practicality, just to give you a little bit of extra oomph on your Dusa hunting pack at the cost of, I think, about 40-ish gold or something like that. So it does bring the price tag up a little bit. One of the other things that isn't necessarily new as in a brand new feature that we created and added in, but I did come across a new hiding trait. So normally things can hide in forest or hide everywhere, and that's basically the sum total of your options. I, however, found a hide in long grass trait. This may be already known to people, but it's a novelty to me and a novelty to the mod, so I'm mentioning it here. The Dusa hunting pack are able to hide in long grass, as you would expect from a four-legged predator, as such as this. So that's kind of nice as well. It does allow you to kind of pick and choose your moments in the right sort of terrain. We're now being very cognizant about where we put long grass into our maps, and we'll have to redesign some of them. But yeah, Dusmanuthan hunting pack, fast moving, nice and mobile, really useful for hunting infantry and skirmishers and things like that, and for cycle charging, and just giving you lots of buttons to click. That being said, they do have a sizable bonus or penalty against cavalry, even if they get bonuses in the woods or snow, the sort of rough terrain where you'd want to have a hunting dog. So cavalry can run them down quite easily. A lot of melee cavalry can really do a number on these things. Even the sort of lower melee defense but high armor cavalry from the House of Feanor, such as the Mounted Company of Kurufin, they will do extremely well against the Dusmanuthan hunting pack. So that's something to be very much aware of. You don't necessarily want to throw them into spears, but because of how quickly they attack and the fact that it's like a minor AoE, sometimes you can clip an extra model, and because you attack quickly, unless those units are relentless, you can potentially stun lock them. So there are some uses for this unit, but again, it comes with some significant drawbacks as well, such as being able to route, having lower morale, etc., etc. Next, we have another unit from, I believe, the Tomb King's faction in Botet. This is the Karangwi Gore Swarm. Sort of small, juvenile insects, perhaps an early form of some of the offspring of Ungoliant, or perhaps its own thing that simply congregates around the Karangwi colonies because it's easy to get food that way. The Karangwi Gore Swarm are not necessarily a counter to cavalry, but sort of a soft option, and a very cheap tar pit unit to allow you to potentially field an entire monster roster, but also to die in the place of things that you actually care about. Individually, they are very pathetic. 4 armor, 4 defense skill. They will die to just about anything and everything. So these are not exactly killing units, but as an added bonus, their bite is particularly nasty against cavalry, and they do get bonuses in woods and deserts, places where you would expect bugs to want to live. Being driven purely by instinct, they will of course charge without orders, but they can also hide anywhere. Currently the animation is a little bit wonky. They're supposed to kind of crawl out of the ground, so I'm still figuring out how to implement that. But yeah, so if you leave cavalry in a prolonged fight with them, through sheer weight of numbers, there's a lot of even fairly tough melee cavalry, though the Feanor cavalry is an exception to this because of their high armor. But higher end cavalry, such as the Scouts of Eglarest or even the Mounted Company of Doriath, will take pretty significant losses in combat with the unit of Karangwi Gore Swarm. They won't beat them. The Karangwi Gore Swarm won't beat those cavalry most of the time because of how cheap and pathetic they are. But they will inflict casualties that are not at all in line with what this unit costs. So that's something you need to be aware of. But yeah, they've got lots of uses, but they're not particularly amazing at any one thing. Mostly they're there for how cheap they are and their willingness to die for the cause. And of course they're lock morale because they just don't care about their losses. They're insects. Yes, it is an ugly planet, a bug planet. Click below and go to our Discord if you would like to know more. In any case, now we're going to move into the Orcish roster. These are all intended to be light infantry, with the exception of the Dusmanuthan Flesh Terrors. So they're the ones who this sort of extra armor was initially intended to be destined for. They are lock morale. Many of the Dusmanuthan units have actually quite high damage. This is actually a low tier unit, clocking in at 9 damage, with a 9 charge bonus. But their defense skill is obviously wretched. Their armor is a little bit better, but 6 is still very, very middling. It's like the lowest end of medium infantry, or almost the lowest end. The shield is quite nice, and does help differentiate them from some of the other units that we're going to see as well. Gives them a little bit of missile resistance, but ultimately 6 shield is just sort of okay. This is a unit that, as I mentioned, is lock morale, has a good charge. It can potentially charge without orders, as many of the Dusmanuthan, or rather Nandan Gorthab units will. I think most of their units are actually impetuous, so they will charge without orders occasionally. Doesn't happen often, but sometimes. But they're also really good at hiding in the woods, because you kind of have to be stealthy. Fierce and stealthy in order to inhabit the Vale of Nandan Gorthab, the Valley of Dreadful Death. So yeah, infantry, sort of a tar pit, not really going to win most fights. Like, there's a lot of chaff grinding units that will completely destroy a unit like this in close quarters. But again, that's not what they're here to do. You're going to win off the backs of your monsters, much more so than any other faction. Next, we have the Dusamenuth and Predators. There's a few notable things about these units. One, they are harassment javelins. So we talked about hunter javelins a little bit earlier. A recap for those of you not in the know at the moment. Hunter javelins are best used for taking down monsters or taking down heavy infantry. Hunter javelins are a little bit slower in flight as well. So if you're paying attention with an elephant unit, you can potentially dodge a significant number of those javelins, which is going to be paramount to your survival in this mod. Silmarillion is all about like soft counters with some hard counters mixed in, but knowing your maps, knowing your terrain, and also situational awareness. It's a really big emphasis on that because of a lot of things, like the way our stat system breaks down. So that's something to be aware of. But unlike unlike the hunter javelins, harassment javelins are much longer range, by about 20 or so meters. They've got way more ammunition, but they have very low damage. They are still armor piercing, as the hunter javelins are as well, but you're not really going to take down any hard targets in the same amount of time using harassment javelins. As you probably noticed in my Avari video, where my grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth basically tanked, 3 or 4 harassment javelin units for half the game before being weak enough to die. Dusamenuth and Predators they sort of follow that schema, but they're also a little bit more numerous than most of the other harassment javelins in the game outside of Valinor, who are particularly good at that with their Teleri, who specialize in it. But yeah, unlike the melee infantry, the skirmish infantry for Nandan Gorthab can in fact rout. So these units have, I believe, a normal morale response, and their morale is decent enough. I think it's like 16, but they can in fact be routed, especially by fear-causing cavalry, morale shocks, the loss of a general, all that kind of stuff. It applies to Dusamenuth and Predators. And as an added bonus, these are the units that ride on top of the Karangri Broodmother. Yeah. They're right there. Anyway. Moving on now, we have another infantry unit and another locked morale unit. Now, the thing that makes them a little bit different from the Dusamenuth and Flesh Terrors is that the Dusamenuth and Skull Splitters are unshielded. They've also got a missile that they can throw. So they've got some throwing axes that they can toss, very crude looking throwing axes, which they can toss before charging into combat. They've also got a little bit less numbers, and they don't have the shield value or the armor value, despite the fact that they're sharing the same model right now for reasons related to some modding stuff. They're a little more lightly armored, there's less of them, but they hit like absolute trucks, whereas the other unit had like 9 melee attack and 9 charge bonus. The Dusamenuth and Skull Splitters are clocking in at 13 melee attack, 20 charge bonus, and a 9 missile damage throwing axe. So as shock infantry, this is basically as good as it gets. Obviously their defense skills are wretched here, and really all you're looking for with these infantry units in Nandan Gorthab, with the melee infantry at least, is relatively cost-effective trades, inflicting what damage you can with these units while supporting your monsters. So these are not like show-stopping, game-winning units, but against certain factions, that 9 missile damage can be extremely deadly. Osirian is one that comes to mind. The Avari are another. Early game Doriath units, again, this is sort of built with them in mind. Things like that. Yeah, so Dusamenuth and Skull Splitters, there they are. Pretty well do what you would expect them to do on the tin. And now, we have the last of these units, and probably one of the more important ones, are the Dusamenuth and Beast Hunters. Now, one of the other things that Nandan Gorthab lacks, as you've probably noticed so far, is spearmen. They do have a singular spear unit, and we'll talk about them in just a second, but for the most part, they do not have traditional anti-cavalry tools. They've got the Karangri Gore Swarm, they've got their monsters and stuff, but all of their other foot-based units, like, say, the Devourers of Children or the Dusamenuth and Hunting Pack, they all have penalties against cavalry. And cavalry can be extremely effective against them. The Devourers of Children, I forgot to mention, are actually an infantry class unit. So Lancers can ride them down like grass. The Dusumnuthan Beast Hunters are not really an exception to that rule. They have the low defense and sort of more high damage of other units, but they also have, I believe, +5 against cavalry. So that 8 melee attack goes up to 13, which can potentially make trading lancers into them or melee cavalry a little bit ineffective if you are going to leave those units in there. So if you lose micro on them, this is a unit that can potentially punish you with that is deceptively strong, at least in terms of cavalry. The other thing they're obviously great at is missile damage. So there's 140 of them. Most archers tend to clock in at like 140, 160 or something like that. But I believe the Dusumnuthan Beast Hunters have a cap of 4, and they've got the best missile attack of any long-ranged Orcish unit. Obviously, in terms of lore, this is going to help them hunt some of the spiders or corral some of the spiders without exposing themselves to the nightmarish beasts that inhabit Nandan Gorthab, who, as we've seen so far, are very, very formidable in close range. Only the craziest of orcs would do that, and that's represented in the fact that those units are lock morale. So lore and gameplay sort of blending into each other in that way. But yeah, an important part of the skirmish line, really the biggest part, next to some of the spider riders, which we're going to see in a second. Other things, they've got pretty good morale, but again, they have a normal response, and yeah, they can be routed. So that is Dusumnuthan Beast Hunters. Fairly straightforward with what these units can do and what they're for. Again, they will be losing that more heavily armored look just as soon as I figure out and have the time to actually commit to doing that. But yeah, there's the orcs. So we're going to move on to the spider rider units, which I'm sure many people are excited about. But for now, let's take a look at the some of the questions and stuff that we may have here. Upgrading fangs, isn't that what dentists are for? That was clever. I appreciate that. You said the spider faction will be non-playable. What exactly does this mean? So the Nandan Gorthab faction will not be something that you can enter into a grand campaign and play, because I think that would be kind of insane. They're a bunch of fanatical orcs and monsters, all just out doing their own thing, just trying to stay alive. So creating an empire and an economy and conquering the world would sort of be outside of the purview of what they would really be equipped to take on. So that's like the logical part of it. But the more gameplay focused part of it is that this unit, as I mentioned, or this faction, as I mentioned, was created to help fill out the map, but also to present a challenge for Doriath, who is one of our playable campaign factions in their early game. So as I've gone through, I've sort of talked about what some of these units were built with having in mind. So things that they can be effective against. And the faction as a whole is a big challenge for Doriath when it comes to their girdle units, the sort of things that they're only going to have access to in their early game. So that's the purpose of Nandan Gorthab. They're in multiplayer because it's a cool idea. They're fun to play. They add a lot of mobility and interesting units with their own mechanics. So that's why they're available in multiplayer. They're included in the mod at all because of those practical concerns for Doriath, and they're not able to be played in campaign because it just would be bizarre to create an empire with hordes of these fanatics who don't really have a sort of central ruling leadership caste, right? There's no impetus to expand beyond their borders. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. Do the Flesh Terrors have a massive 3 in the EDU? I can't remember if I fixed that or not. I was up until like 2 o'clock in the morning trying to get the patch ready for everyone today, so I'm not 100% sure on that, Artorias, but you can always take a look. Moving on now, we can take a look at some of the spider units. So, mechanically, many of the spiders that we've seen so far have been elephant classed. So there's a lot of things that come with that, certain bonuses that apply to them. They can remove stakes by riding over them, vulnerable to fire, things like that. The Karangwi hunters here are, for the purposes of game mechanics, considered to be horses. Don't think too hard on it. I know they're not horses, but this is just mechanics, right? So all the bonuses that apply to horses, so the recent buffs to spear units, other things like that, will apply to the Karangwi hunters. But in terms of their role and what they do, Karangwi Hunters sort of have a dual purpose, which I didn't expect for them to have, but they ended up having, and I'm kind of okay with it. So they are a spear cavalry. They're one of the only, actually I think they are the only spear unit. The only unit using a large pointy stick, which is a little bit crazy for caveman orcs. You'd expect more people to do that, but Karangwi Hunters have spears that they can use to fight other cavalry in close quarters. They also have a +4 that all spider-based cavalry get against most mount types, so wargs, horses, and elephants / monsters, Sauron and Morgoth and so forth, that they can use to be fairly formidable. They've got a good charge bonus of 12, and they've got a melee attack of 8 with their spear, which is quite sizable, but also not all that crazy given that they've got 25 models in the unit. They have quite light armor, only about 5 or so there, so that puts them into sort of the medium category, but still not super amazing. And they've got a really strong missile attack of 6. They fire poison arrows, because of course they do. They're spider riders. And they're relatively expensive, clocking in at 950. You in multiplayer you will be able to bring 3 of them, and they're just useful. Yeah, they're one of them and the Beast Hunters are sort of the linchpin of what makes Nandan Gorthab a really strong skirmish faction potentially. Really nice support builds that include the Karangwi Hunters in multiplayer, which you'll hopefully see lots of in the upcoming tournament. Yeah, they're just a really cool unit, and with that charge bonus, charging into the rear of things. I spoke a little bit earlier about our stat system. One of the big sort of shifts away from DAC, who is very, very armor heavy, is that Silmarillion is very, very melee defense heavy and a little bit lighter on shield and much lighter on armor. And the reason for that is there's a couple of things. One, our missile units deal less damage, and melee defense is countered by missiles. And 2, it helps reward you for making strong tactical decisions and really gives you the payoff. So how many people have had been in a situation where you charge into the back of a unit, but that unit has like 30 armor or something, and despite the fact that you got a direct charge into the rear, you didn't do any damage to them. In Silmarillion, that's kind of the opposite. So if you're charging into the front of a unit, most of the time when they have that high melee defense, you're not really going to do much. You're going to kind of bounce off, and then they're going to have a chance to counter you, hit you with missiles, charge in some infantry, charge in cavalry of their own. But when you're charging into the rear of things in Silmarillion, because everything is so melee focused, even horse archers can potentially deal a decent amount of damage with a rear charge into most of the units in the game. There are some exceptions, heavier infantry and so forth, things with multiple HP, etc. But yeah, that's kind of what these units can be really good for. Flanking, rear charges, and that sort of asymmetrical warfare really makes a lot of sense for Nandan Gorthab. So when you're playing, you're creating blobs and you're punishing them, or you're, rampaging through people's lines, creating chaos, and then you can take advantage of that chaos with certain units like the Karangwi Hunters. But they're not super fast. Most units are a little bit faster than them. But once things begin to rout, that fear effect and the stacking fear effects that Nandan Gorthab can bring to bear, the Spider Riders can be useful for running down units and making sure that they don't come back. So it does a lot of things. I don't know if it's an essential unit. I strongly suspect it might be, because you can take them almost as a replacement for an extra unit or 2 of the Beast Hunters. So you could use 2 Beast Hunters and 3 of the Spider Riders and still do really well in a skirmish fight, and have extra money to devote to other things. I normally don't like it when units are that useful and that versatile, but in this case, it really does enable Nandan Gorthab to bring a plethora of different builds, some more melee focused, some less, some more skirmish focused, So I'm kind of okay with that state of affairs as it is for the time being. So, Karangwi Hunters, good armor, or rather, good damage, terrible armor, strong missile damage, poison, and they've got a good charge as well, which makes them a nice sort of all-around unit. That being said, they're a little bit lower on the model count, but they do have 3 HP per model. But skirmishing them down is obviously a really big part of dealing with a unit like this. But of course, because of their range, you will have to bring horse archers into range and take a little bit of damage in exchange, which I feel is fair and prevents this unit from being completely outclassed by a lot of the other existing ones. The only unit I think that can do better against them is the Assyrian horse archers, and they've had their range lowered a little bit, so it's really only a 5-meter difference. So even against the Silmarillion, you can still kind of bully a little bit with the Karangwi archers. Moving on now to the bodyguard, which currently still have, I think, a bugged UV when it comes to the heads on their backs. But we're going to have the sort of chieftains, if you can call them chieftains, one of the biggest, strongest, ugliest, and most scarred orcs who live in Nandan Gorthab, who have managed to, who are either just exiles from other orcish factions who have brought their own equipment with them, or managed to scavenge them from others who have, and they have killed themselves, or perhaps they've just scavenged from travelers and reshaped according to their own crude means and designs. But this is actually the only heavily armored infantry unit in the entire Nandan Gorthab faction. It is a bodyguard tier unit, and of course it has the price tag to match there, costing 1150. You can upgrade their damage, I think, for an average amount of about like 30 or 40. But you can also upgrade their armor. Currently they don't have an armor upgrade, and they probably won't get one, or they may in the future, I don't know. But it is quite expensive. It costs you about 80 to do. So at the end of the day, you end up paying like, over 1,200 gold to take one of these units. They are capped at 3, and this is again to be a little bit more versatile. Allow Nandan Gorthab, if they wanted to field a more infantry-focused army with some like cavalry and spider support, using the Dusamanuthan Flesh Feasters as their core. They are the only Inspire unit that the Nandan Gorthab roster has, but they don't really need it all that much, since most units won't be able to take advantage of it. But it does kind of synergize well, like I said, with using them as the core of an army, and then building, skirmishers and support around them. So that way they can sort of help your skirmishers stay in the fight a little bit better, things like that. The Dusamanuthan Flesh Feasters, however, can rout themselves. They do have the disciplined morale response rate, so it's not easy to do, but it is definitely possible to rout them off. They are not completely psychotic. They're very survival focused. They haven't lived this long only to throw away their lives the way some of the other Dusamanuthan orc units will. They're also relentless, so they don't have a stagger animation, and that means that they can be very, very potent on the offense here. So 18 base damage, 24 charge, completely destructive off of a charge. That being said, they do have lower defense skill, so if you wanted to, I don't know, sack a Lancer or something into them, the House of Ingolfin Lancers of Anon and Galuth are a little bit more expensive, but still less expensive than Dusamanuthan Flesh Feasters. If you could sack one of those units into a Flesh Feaster and, kill off most of it, then potentially you can pay for that unit pretty well. So lower end Lancers, more expendable things like that can be quite effective against them, unless they've got their armor upgrade, in which case they become a little bit sturdier, but like I said, you do pay for that. They also can't hide because of that heavy armor. Most of the heavy units in our mod can't hide unless they're like an elven, like a Sylvan Elf faction, like a Silmarillion and Doriath can hide heavy infantry in the woods. These guys, however, cannot. Combat bonus in the woods, somewhat strangely, but they are still Dusamanuthan orcs, used to hiding and fighting in that sort of terrain. And they've got a devastating charge as well. But yeah, that's them. Can move on now to their mounted equivalent. We have the Karangwi Blood Gorgers. Very metal names, right? I feel like we could... Actually, I'm pretty sure there is a Nandan Gorthab metal band, so I don't know. Maybe we can collab in the future. Who knows? But anyway, so the Karangwi Blood Gorgers, one of the only sort of predominantly melee-focused spider cavalry units in Nandan Gorthab. They cause fear to enemy infantry, as they would. They are, of course, spiders being ridden by some of the Flesh Feasters. They get bonuses when fighting in the woods, which is lovely. Their armor is what you would expect, but a little bit higher than the Flesh Feasters. That's just a mechanical thing in my stat system, not anything to do with the model itself. Their defense skill is a little bit lower. Currently they have a shield of 7, which they probably shouldn't have. I should do something about that. But yeah, so should not have a shield of 7. Instead, they should have no shield, and they have hit points that amount to 5. Obviously, it is a very small unit. 12 riders in there, 13 if you decide to throw your general into them, which isn't the worst idea. Really not a bad idea at all because of how potentially tanky they can be. But yeah, Karangwi Blood Gorgers do what they do on the box. Decent charge there. Their weapon type is currently crude, but I need to fix that. I don't really know what that means. Higher base damage, not quite as high as the unmounted equivalent, but of course they have the extra HP. They've got the mobility from being a cavalry unit, things like that. They are technically classed as horses, so horse-based counters can be very useful against them, as can armor piercing. Yeah, things like that. As I mentioned, they frighten enemy infantry, combat bonuses in woods and deserts, the sort of places you'd expect to see spiders. And apparently they can hide in the woods. I should fix that. Like I said, work in progress here. So that is going to be the Nandan Gorthab faction. I think you kind of know everything that you'd ever need to know about them. Just to recap, focus on monsters, light infantry, a lot of mobility, missile play, and things like that, which makes them fairly unique in terms of the orcish factions that we currently have in the mod. And I think in the greater modding sphere as well, there's not really any faction for the orcs that I know of that can competently skirmish with the good guys. Usually they're all very like close combat, numbers oriented, and things like that. But yeah, orcs aren't even, I hesitate to call them an orc faction. They're not even, you know, the most important part of this roster. It's really the big old monsters and the horrors and the abomination. I swear we'll get this fixed before release. Now, let's take a quick break there. I am going to look at any questions and things like that you guys may have. So now is the time to kind of open them up. I know people have questions about campaign, about the dwarves. We do have some other new factions that we will be adding to the multiplayer docket as well, who will appear on the campaign map in a similar capacity to Nandan Gorthab and the Avari, as being AI-only factions that add flavor and present new challenges and gameplay opportunities for when you're playing in the campaign. So if you guys have those questions, now would be a fabulous time to ask. And meanwhile, why don't we... We'll run this. It's going to desync, but that's fine. Just a little bit of visual spice. Let's see here. Barring any questions for the time being, I will talk a little bit about some of the changes you can expect to see in multiplayer, but I want to start with a couple of things. One, it is currently my goal, and this is something that could potentially change because my modding team have lives and they like to do things that aren't just playing video games all the time or working on video games. I would like to try and get the patch out for around Christmas time, before Christmas. So hopefully in that December area. Now, what does this mean? So before, I wanted to release the patch when we had a working campaign, basically. Not necessarily a polished campaign, but a sort of sandbox campaign. Currently, our campaign lead developer is also one of the lead developers for Divide and Conquer. So he is a busy bee, and he's recently started reworking on the height map and regions and things like that. And I have it from him that in terms of region count, you can expect to see the maximum amount. So around 200 or so of the individual regions on the map. But yeah, we'll follow up on that in just a second. So the point of this is that we will be releasing the patch just a little bit early because it has been about 7 or so months since our last release, and that will include some of the new factions that you've seen here today. I believe it will also include a sort of minimum viable roster for the dwarves. Now, in terms of progress, the dwarves have their entire mid-tier roster done. They've got all the bodyguards done, and they've got one high tier done. So there's a few things still left, some of their unique artillery pieces and the models that come with them, and I believe there's a couple, at least one or maybe even two high tiers left to add to the dwarven faction before they are fully completed. But from talking to my development team, we will have a minimum viable roster for the dwarves out in the next patch. So you will be able to play with them, and we will follow up with their own spotlight video and stream, etc., and so forth. It will also include Nandan Gorthab, who you saw today, as they are almost done. There's like one unit left for them, and we can talk about them a little bit later. It's kind of cool though. It's a baneling. It explodes on contact with people, and I'm really excited to try that out. It will also include the Avari. So you're going to be getting 3 new factions in this patch. Actually 4. Sorry, I forgot about the Blessed Realm of Valinor. They've been in here for so long that it's sort of they're just part of the crew, part of the ship, part of the crew. So in fact, you will be getting 4 new factions in this new update, which I hope to release by December. But it does mean that we won't be including the campaign in this update. That will come at a little bit later, because that's just how it kind of has to be. We've still got a couple of other factions that we're still working on and creating, but at the moment, it is very conceivable in the very near future that we will be shifting all of our efforts, mine included, and the rest of the team, over to working on campaign things, whether that be units or helping with scripting or just helping Finn kind of get where he needs to be. It will hopefully also include some new music that was created for us by Argus and a fellow on the Discord whose name is Big Duck Energy. He is very talented. They're both very talented. And some of their music will be featured in an upcoming video. Some new music, hopefully some new voice acting lines as well. Some of my voice acting previews that you've seen for Tollen Gorthab. We also have some other people who volunteered, so there should be some new sounds, new maps. A ton of, actually on that note, there will be a ton of new assets in the battle editor. And we will also be having some of our very first proprietary siege maps. Camwool, the Easterling, who I believe I saw down in the chat there, has, I'm pretty sure he's already made a Himring map, like a proper siege map. And assuming that that is fully tested and bug-free and good to go, that will also be included in the new patch. So you will be able to do some proper Silmarillion sieges, at least the very start of them, and not just cityscape maps. So that's really exciting as well. Yeah. So that's kind of where we're at. So I'm hoping to have it out by December, but in the event that we're not able to do that, you know, sometimes things come up. We're all people who do this for free in our spare time, and while we love doing it, not everyone wants to really do it all the time. Not everyone is an obsessive lunatic the way that I am. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping. That may be subject to change, but December is kind of what I'm thinking here. Let's see. Have anything else in the chat there? No, it's not looking like it. That's totally fine. So yeah, that's where we're at with the release date. That's kind of the state of campaign at the moment. One other note about campaign, for those of you hungry for more information about it out there, I'm just going to throw this down. I have spoke to Finn about some of the ideas that have been either put forward to me or that I had for campaign in previous streams that we have discussed. And one of those is crafting sieges that are kind of amazing and kind of innovative and not something that I think anyone has done anywhere else that are really going to do justice. Not just by like making huge maps, which can be kind of laggy and stuff, but sort of offloading the work of, you know, one map. So instead of having just a massive like fortress that's like, oh, that's Angband, then you conquer it once and it's sort of one and done, you know, especially against the AI, that cannot be all that much fun. What we're going to be doing is kind of splitting it up into stages. So Gondolin is one such city, Angband is another, and I think maybe Nargothrond to a lesser extent, but Angband and Gondolin are two of the big ones that I think people are going to be really excited about. So let's get down to it. The idea that we have, that I have been told is definitely doable, is say you're laying siege to Thangorodrim. You're not just going to, you know, take one city and then that's it, you've defeated evil. There will be several stages to it. So you'll have a map that leads into another map. So 3 regions, all sort of that railroad you and guide you one into the other. You'll have, you know, the gates of Angband. And then Angband is a massive industrial complex that stretches far underground. So then you'll be in the vaults of Angband. And then finally, your siege will culminate in a siege of Morgoth's throne, which is a third map in there. So when it comes to tinking Thangorodrim, you're not just going to, you know, make one doom stack, throw it at the city, and then, you know, you've done the thing. It's going to cost you potentially quite a lot, because we do intend to have some garrison scripts in order to make those sieges challenging sort of late game events. So if you want to take Angband, you better come with your guns loaded. And the same applies to anybody who wants to lay siege to Gondolin, for example. So there's a few ways that can take shape. One would be the sort of outer area that will have its own, like the various gates and stuff. So you'll have to, fight your way through the gate guards of Gondolin on the outside. Or if you managed to, if you manage to actually make it to the plains inside of that ring of mountains, then you've got to siege the walls. And then you've got to have a battle in the marketplace, which is something that is featured pretty heavily in the Fall of Gondolin. I highly recommend reading it. There's a huge battle that takes place in the marketplace, many great deeds are done, etc., etc. And then potentially you may even have a sort of final siege of a smaller keep representing the Tower of the King, and sort of the last stand of the defenders that would be there. So those are the sort of things that you can expect from the Silmarillion campaign, especially in terms of our siege maps, which are finally starting to roll out now 2 years after the fact. So Himring will be available to you. I would love to see all of those individual siege maps, so the Market of Gondolin, etc., being available in custom battle as well. But that's something that we'll be working on, long into the future. But yeah, so all that being said, the other thing I want to talk to you about today is that we have a tournament coming up. That is going to be starting very soon, actually. What is it, the 26th of October today? The tournament will be beginning in November, I believe. Either the 1st of November or the first week of November. I'm not technically organizing it. I'm just providing a prize pool, and it's going to be of $500. It's going to be $300 to the first team, and then I forget how it breaks down, the rest of it. I think it's like 140 to the next, to the second place team, and then like 60 or something to the third place team. That makes sense. So yeah, you'll be seeing that. You'll be seeing some live streams and things like that will be coming out, and whoever is streaming on that day, I'm hoping that it's going to be me, but I am also a full-time student, and I work 30-ish hours a week, so my weeks are pretty long, so it may not be me who's able to stream that, but we will be broadcasting that live, either on that streamer's channel, or if it's me, we'll be doing it on the new official Silmarillion Total War channel. And I will be uploading a lot of videos or development logs and diaries and just discussions and things like that onto that channel. And I will be including that in the description of all of my further videos. I foolishly didn't bring the link to it with me here, but it also does still need a little bit of setup. So that'll be something that you'll be hearing about in the future. But the finals will be put on to the official Silmarillion Total War channel, as will most of the other coverage that is being done by myself. We will also be opening up donations for people, and that will be split 60-40 in favor of the players. So 60% goes to the players, 40% goes to whoever happens to stream it that day, be it myself, be it UMAD Commander, or whoever else really wants to kind of step up and do that, and whoever else is available. So that's really exciting. I will give you guys more news about that in the future. But yeah, it's a nice little pre-Christmas kind of treat, and we may be following that up with some more tournaments come Christmas time, depending on kind of how things go and what funds are like. Because I like being able to fund these, and I like being able to kind of do those nice things for the community. So we'll kind of see where we're at. And yeah, so tournament, that's the patch update, or rather the patch release date. And that's sort of the two things I wanted to talk to you about. So now let's see if we have any questions here, and then I can go into maybe some of the more interesting gameplay related things that you can expect to see in multiplayer for the multiplayer crowd. Let's see here. I'll go ahead and restart my Rome Total War playlist as well. So no additional questions, totally chill. We'll talk a little bit about some of the gameplay stuff that's coming in. So let's start with the newest patch. One of the big things is that light infantry has been made a little bit faster, and some of the counters to specifically horse cavalry, not wargs, horses, not elephants, horses, that have come up in the last little while. So one of the things that I've noticed, and a lot of our other testers have noticed, is that missiles and cavalry have kind of come to the forefront in the last little while. And while I fully recognize that metas shift all the time and there's a whole lot of human psychology wrapped up in, what people think is good and what they're willing to use and, what strategies are currently being employed, and there's all kinds of stuff. You can't just make changes and not be patient. Sometimes you kind of have to wait and see. But I have seen several games that I've been in where cavalry are the most important units on the field. And while I think that's an okay state of affairs for certain factions some of the time, or certain builds some of the time, I do want to kind of bridge that gap a little bit, if at all, that I am able to. So we're not nerfing cavalry because I want cavalry to be strong. I want it to be an important part of your roster. But I do also want infantry to be kind of the focus of the mod, as much as can be done. Obviously, just fully infantry focused to the exclusion of everything else gets a little bit rushy, and it just isn't as much fun. It's not as interactive, it's not as engaging, because after you get your skirmishers and your infantry into a fight, then there's not a whole lot for you to do. You're basically playing the dwarves all the time, everywhere, which I'm not a big fan of. So we are taking some steps to bridge the gap between cavalry and infantry, and one of the, I think, most reasonable changes is that a lot of one-handed spear units are getting an extra point of damage specifically against horse units, horse-mounted units. Some of the other units, such as, which is why I chose this replay here, the Spearmen of Brithambar, or the Avari Battle Guard, who we saw earlier, or the Foresters of Nimbrethil, who are also within the Elven Falas faction, will be getting +2. A lot of other light infantry are getting faster, allowing them to better screen out cavalry or to more quickly engage themselves in melee, run down missile units, bows, and so forth, who are innately much slower than they are. So that's giving you more to do. It's going to increase your micro attacks a little bit, but it's also going to make you feel not quite so helpless, especially in those bigger team games. Silmarillion, of course, being a big team-based mod. It's important that everyone feels powerful, has something to contribute outside of the factions that have heavy cavalry. So yeah, something we've been working on. Also, the Spearmen of Eglarest here from the Falas, as I paid some particular attention to the factions that specialize in spears. They're also going to be getting a little bit of a higher spear bonus, so they'll be able to better take down cavalry. And in this particular matchup, it is fully possible to bring a 20 stack and still bring 4 Marines of Eglarest, despite the fact that they are capped at 2 and the red price kicks in after that. So lots of options, lots of creativity with your builds. That's kind of what we're trying to do, and that was one of our main goals for the last patch as well, is to prevent people from being railroaded. I've spoken about that a little bit now, various points throughout the stream, but I think at this point you're starting to understand, how important that is to me in terms of gameplay, and as somebody who's in charge of designing all of this stuff. So that's pretty cool. Some of the other important things, I wonder if we can find one of the elephant units on here. I know that they have a grandfather, but he's probably hiding somewhere. One of the other big things is, because we've added so many elephant and monster type units to the game, I don't want this to be Warhammer. I mean, I like Warhammer, I've played Warhammer, I've put Warhammer campaigns on the stream, but one of my personal criticisms, this is actually echoed by a lot of people. Go ask Indie Pride, go ask anybody who plays, competitive Warhammer Total War games. It's very missile and monster focused, and infantry sort of plays second fiddle in a lot of ways. As I mentioned, I want it to be more infantry focused in Silmarillion, and I don't want monsters to just run roughshod over everything, because while I think those units are fun to use, it can be a little bit frustrating and also not that much fun. There's not a lot of gratifying payoff when you just click on something with your monsters and have them delete that unit. Or the second that a counter comes nearby, they just immediately pull out, throw everybody around, and hightail it out of there and move on to the next thing. It can just leave you feeling like you're kind of pushing your Sisyphus, pushing that rock up that hill, only to have it roll back down again when you're trying to counter monsters. So there's been some pretty significant mass changes to monsters. They've gone from 20 or 30 mass, which is when they were tossing everybody around, to between 6 and 8. And while they still push through infantry very easily, what they don't do is toss them around anymore. So when they would toss them around, it would basically eliminate the damage window, right? So there's the grandfather getting pushed out of here. it would basically eliminate the damage window. So they could just push through two-handed axemen and whatever, and as long as they're quick about it, it doesn't really matter, right? Because you're never going to catch them. They rush through, they don't get hit, they just knock everybody over, and then it doesn't even matter that they made a positioning mistake, that they ran through a unit of two-handed axemen who would normally clobber them. The fact that their mass was so high, it made that irrelevant. So now you can still push through them, so you can't just, get bogged down super easily with your elephants and be scratching your head wondering why your massive monsters can't push through tiny man-sized squishy things. But now, when you're pushing through those units, they will have an opportunity to attack you. The radius as well on some elephants has been increased to be about 2 models, like 2 man-sized models, assuming not huge loose formation positioning like this. So when you run through those units, you do take a little bit of damage, and it just helps factions like say the Avari, for example, who'd otherwise just be tossed around like ragdolls and completely overrun when facing against, say, Nandan Gorthab, for example. Now you pay a little bit of a troll toll when you push through things like that. Yeah, so elephants are a little bit more reasonable. They've all got really high HP and model counts anyway. That's one of the other things that I've changed, is increasing the model count of elephants. So now there's more of them. You don't just instantly lose your elephants pushing through units, or if you lose 1 or 2 out of a unit of 5, then 3 is still pretty combat effective. And a lot of those units also have fear effects. In the case of Balrogs, they've got a morale buffing effect, so they can be useful for other reasons as well. So that's a pretty good dynamic. It's so far felt really good from what I've had an opportunity to sort of see in game, both from tester replays and from playing them myself. Yeah, it feels really good. Doesn't feel broken. And your elephants don't feel weak and pathetic, like they're always going to get caught out and destroyed, but at the same time, people who are facing you, they have a shot, right? And the counters, the infantry foot-based counters, actually are doing their job now, which is a really, really big deal. So that's pretty cool. Let's see, some of the other things we've added in. I did mention that I found a new hiding trait earlier, and that we're going to be integrating that sort of long grass into future map design. So this map here, again, chose this one for a reason, is one that I recently made for our upcoming tournament that I mentioned. And it's called the Haunted Moor, and there's a lot of different terrain types at play. So you're going to see the long grass strategically used in a few different places. One here in the center, and then on each side there's various places. So there's a forest here, then there's long grass, so you can potentially hide quite a lot of units in these little areas. So that's something that you're going to see a little bit more of. And then we're just going to be shifting the way that we do map design to accommodate that new trait, and also to add more hidden places. So a lot of our maps right now have 2 or 3 hiding places, and it's fairly easy to figure out where people are going to be. Those hiding places are relatively small, and yeah, they're few and far between. So you're always going to check those places first. Now we've got some more situations like this. So this kind of hiding area is going to be out of reach of both factions. It's a nice little hidey hole that you can rush forwards to. Another good reason to have people push forward instead of relying on, missiles to sit back and pelt people for 1,000 years, having a little bit of staring contest. Now you're incentivized not just with some of the other changes that I'm going to talk about, but also with the way that maps have been designed. So yeah, more terrain bonuses being activated here, which in turn makes the units that have those terrain bonuses more useful, more applicable. There's more situations where they can be brought to bear and be effective. But it's also, giving you access to a lot of gratifying tactics. I talked about that a little bit in the showcase video that I'm going to do for Nandan Gorthab. That'll be up a little bit later today. But yes, that's another good example of it. So speaking of missiles, one of the other recent changes has been to specifically bow skirmishers. So where did I hide them in this game? I think I put them over here. So units like the Rangers of Berthombar, for example. All mid-tier, specifically mid-tier bowmen, because of how numerous and cheap and how high their caps are relative to high-tier units, and also their ammo is a little bit higher than the others as well. Not just through model count, but through just having higher ammunition. They've had their range reduced by between 5 to 10, depending on who we're talking about here. Assyrian, it doesn't get hit with this penalty nearly as much, but other factions are going to notice it. So low tier Angband and Tollen Gorthab bowmen, for example, have gone from 160 range to 150. The idea there obviously is not dramatic. You don't want to... It's a very fine balance there, because if we lower it too much, then there are mid-range skirmishers like slingers and stuff that can then counter your bowmen. And while that's okay for some units, other units like elven archers and things like that, people want them to have good range, and I think that they should have that, and I think that that's a big part of what makes these units pretty good. That being said, the -10, it is still noticeable, so you are going to have to like come closer, and it's going to shrink that DMZ that I've seen forming, and you can kind of see it here. So me here, and then across the field we've got a Finarfin army who's sitting there with a ton of skirmishers. Really combine arms, which is great. You know, that's what I like to see. But yeah, there's the DMZ that's going on here, and the only reason that it's changed at all, and why, you know, the Halidin and stuff over here are able to kind of push forward and be aggressive, is because of this. Mounted Company, right? There's a huge... In this match, there was massive cavalry superiority in favor of our team. And it really necessitated the Valinor player, one, skirmishing for a while, but the only movement they made was to try and run away from the cavalry, which I don't really want to be the case. Obviously, skirmishing should be important, and there's so many tactics and like gratifying like gameplay opportunities when you're playing with skirmishers and you manage to kind of bully people a little bit. But I don't want it to just be a DMZ, right? Which is, it's night and day. Here, center, and then whoever has some heavy cavalry over here that can tank missiles are being able to move forward and be aggressive and really control the pace of the game. So that's something that I am genuinely concerned about, and not just because, you know, oh, cavalry bad, you know, I don't want like micro cavalry or something. You can really see it. It's very stark here. It's night and day, and all the Valinor split shot slingers here, and these are really the only cavalry units that can sort of tank the storm that you're seeing coming their way, with the marksmen of Nargothrond and other things like that. So a lot of those long range skirmishers have had their range reduced. Not so much that they're useless, but it is still noticeable. And other things have happened as well. So a lot of other melee cavalry options. So there's not really a ton on the field here, but factions like Doriath or the Philothrum, for example. So my faction. This is pre those changes, so I'm playing a little bit more traditionally and a little bit more safely. But the Philothrum have a melee cavalry. They have the Scouts of Eglarest. They're a little bit cheap, a little bit cheaper, because they are more lightly armored than the Doriath equivalent, who I think costs like 70 or 80 more, something like that. But not only have those high-tier melee cavalry been made a little bit cheaper on the red prices, so you can dip into the red more comfortably without, you know, completely destroying your budget. So not only are those prices being reduced, so that you can potentially bring more of them in situations where you need it, like, say, if you're facing off against a horde of Feanor cavalry. High-tier cavalry, high-tier melee cavalry, of which the where are they? The Mounted Company of Kudufin, they have some similarities with high-tier cavalry, and they have some traits that they have in common, but they are not high-tier. So they get +4 against horse-based units. Now those other high-tier cavalry units, like the Scouts of Eglarest, like the Waltschreider Dragoons, the Doriath Mounted Company of Region, basically any high-tier cavalry with 50 models in it is going to get an extra point of damage. On top of that, all of those high-tier cavalry units are going to upgrade their attack value for it's like 20 or 25 gold, something like that. So it's going to be cheaper than what it was previously. And all of this is in aid of not crippling the Sons of Feanor and not like removing their specialty, but just giving people more options that they can stand up to them a little bit better. Now, the important thing is that you're still going to want to have infantry to support these cavalry units, because they will, and I spent like 3 hours testing this meticulously yesterday, they will in most cases still lose outright to the Mounted Company of Feanor, or the Mounted Company of Kudufin. It's a closer game, for sure, but yeah, so it's important because Mounted Company are still very heavily armored. Most of these missile units are not going to do a whole lot to them, but light infantry being faster, some of the light one-handed spearmen in particular being a little bit stronger against cavalry, that allows them to keep pace with some of those melee cavalry options, so you can like double down on melee cavalry, support them with infantry, and then when you're using those combined arms, then you can beat the House of Feanor's cavalry, which they pay quite a lot for, and which are so strong at the moment. So I think that's a reasonable implementation. I think that it all sort of feeds into each other without hurting the Sons of Feanor for being good at what they're supposed to be good at doing. That, and it's also like a skill-based counter, right? It's not just like I add more AP archers with 180 range, and then you point them at heavy cavalry and zone them out without even trying. There's a back and forth. There's a cat and mouse, and I think that's a better dynamic. So that's, yeah, I like that. I'm proud of that. I think that's addressing a practical problem with smart design options and not just cranking up the power on stuff. So yeah, that's one of the things you can expect to see. Hopefully it doesn't just make cavalry irrelevant. I don't think it will. I think that's a very reasonable and modest implementation that doesn't break factions or punish them for being good at what they do. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at so far. Let's see if we have any additional questions. Doesn't look like it so far, and I think, yeah, we're basically at the end of it here. So I want to thank you guys for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for showing interest in the mod. If you guys are interested in following the tournament or following the process of our development, you can always take a look in the description. You're going to find our Discord there, our official Discord channel. You're also going to find the ModDB and links to friends and related projects and things like that. So hopefully this was interesting for you, and I hope you're really excited for some of the new stuff that we have coming out. So before I sign off there, I would, for those of you who have stuck around and stuck it out with me so far, I would also like to talk a little bit about two of the new factions that we're going to be adding in before I sign off today. And they're going to be multiplayer focused. Pardon me. Talking without stop for like 3 hours. It's a lot. And those are going to be the Brood of Glaurung. So another evil faction. So we're going to diversify the evil factions a little bit. Previously we just had Toll and Angband, but now you'll have Toll, Angband, Nandan Gorthab, and the Brood of Glaurung. Previously the Brood of Glaurung was intended to be just a sort of reskin of Angband that's just there to kind of fill out the map and be a pain in the butt for the House of Finarfin at various points throughout the game. But now they're going to be their own fully fledged multiplayer faction. They will, of course, feature lots of beasties, dragons. Glaurung will be getting his own model. Eventually, anyway. The first implementation might not have him with his final model, but he will be getting one eventually. That's one of the goals I've set for myself in my game design programs. I want to fully design Glaurung from the ground up. I'm leaning towards like a giant fire-spitting iguana or like a bearded dragon or something. And once I get some more concept art done for that, I will definitely show that off to you. But the Brood of Glaurung will focus on medium infantry. They're going to lack crossbows and armor-piercing projectiles and things like that. I don't think they have any javelins at all in what I've given them, though they may have some harassment javelins or something like that. I think they actually have some harassment javelins. And the intention there is to be sort of the Nandan Gorthab. What Nandan Gorthab is to Doriath, they're going to be to the House of Finarfin. So they will be able to sort of match them, but also be a foil to them in a few different ways. They will have a little bit more emphasis. Actually, now that I think about it, they will have some emphasis on the mid-range combat. They've also got the medium armor, which is what the House of Finarfin kind of does really well, better than anybody else. And yeah, so that's kind of where the Brood of Glaurung is at right now. Castellan of Angmar is going to be taking point on making orc units for them, and I've seen some of his concept art so far, and it's awesome. Oh, it's so good, and I can't wait to show you guys more of that once I have more things available to you, or to me. So Brood of Glaurung will be available in multiplayer. They will be present on the campaign map, though not as a playable faction. And that brings us to our final new faction, This one again being made by Steered of Dale, who was responsible for the Avari. And those are the Elves of Mithrim. The Grey Elves of Mithrim, who I've been informed are in fact Sindar. I make a mistake in that in the video you're going to see a little bit later. They are going to be focused on their infantry as well. Again, we want to bring that infantry focus back into the mod. And they will also have some decent missile units with low ammo counts, but they will have some unique projectiles. One of them that I'm working on currently is sort of like a shard arrow, which sort of explodes along the same way as the mangonel does, and that you have to judge its range, so it's a little bit skill-based. And it will explode into a shower of smaller projectiles that can deal damage in an area. It'll deal lower damage, so it's something you maybe want to use against like hordes of enemies and things like that. Although that's an implementation that may end up changing. It may end up being like an armor-piercing thing, but with really, really low ammo. So if you're using it against, you know, light infantry or medium infantry, then you're kind of using it wrong. Yeah, the other things that they'll be good at are their shield value. So they'll have very low armor, lower melee defense, but they'll have really good shields, which somewhat compensates for that. Oh, there goes the grandfather. Poor lad. Got hacked to bits by the Ulfidin. It happens. So yeah, the Brood of Glaurung, the Elves of Mithrim, those are the two factions you're going to be seeing come into the mod after the Dwarves. They may even end up being included in the very next faction, because Steward of Dale and Melkon, one of our other developers, have been very prodigiously productive, that's what I wanted, in the last few days. They've got most of the roster ready to go. It just needs to be tested, so it probably will not be seen or included in the tournament update that will be coming out in December, but hopefully coming out in December, but you will be seeing them eventually. It's possible that you'll see them in at least the Elves of Mithrim in the December update. The Brood of Glaurung, I'd say there's no chance for that, but the Elves of Mithrim, there is definitely a strong possibility that you will get to play as them in the update that I will hopefully be able to release in December. But in any case, that's enough. I hope you guys have enjoyed the stream. It was a big old long one. I need a glass of water and a bit of a break. Super excited to see the turnout we had today. I think we had like 28 people at some point, which is pretty high for one of my streams. Yeah, really grateful for the support that we've gotten from the community so far, and I'm really looking forward to having you guys along with us for all the stuff that comes next. So my name is Jordan, also known as JMonster. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you are excited for Silmarillion, and hopefully not too disappointed that the next sort of mini patch, interim patch update is not going to have the campaign in it, but we are working hard on it, and you will definitely get campaign stuff in the very near future. I may post an update on the height map so you can sort of see what the basic outline of the map is going to look like, but anyway, I will talk forever here, so hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.